All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Today is May 2nd, 2021. I'm Roy Potter. Welcome as you come in. Uh, I've been talking to some people about some of the books that I've been suggesting to read on the first century. And it's pretty daunting when you start looking at the amount of information available, despite maybe what you've been aware of in the past. And I don't want to scare, good morning, everyone. I don't want to scare anybody away that I'm talking about scripture again this morning, because I'm really not talking about scripture this time, okay? I'm talking about history, solely history at this point. And why, again, am I going to bring it up? Because if we understand what happened in the first century with those who were trying to secure their liberty against the Roman invasion of their country, if we understand what was happening there, we can apply it to what's happening today. And there's some big lessons there. I started to bring it out. One of my last videos, I mentioned, I said, there was this thing that the liberty fighters in the first century, the Messianic movement, trying to fight against Rome, there were a couple of different factions that were pushing this war against Rome. One was basically saying, as an example, and that's why I'm bringing this up, that all we need to do is be righteous. All we have to do is show God that we're righteous, that we're pure, and God will give us a victory. He'll send his angelic host to fight our battles for us. And I talked about that, and maybe some people didn't quite understand the point. The point is that it didn't work, okay? And that's why I pulled in the Gettysburg situation with Pickett's charge, because the thing that General Lee and General Pickett, by the way, General Longstreet was totally against this. He could see the folly of it. Marching across that open field towards Seminary Ridge, where the Union Army was basically dug in and fortified and had the higher ground, while the Confederate divisions moved across that open field. It was like shooting, you know, open season. I mean, there was nothing to stop the slaughter that occurred. But it happened because Pickett and Lee thought that they had God on their side, that because of their purity and the righteousness of their cause, God would give them the victory. Well, it didn't happen, as you know. If you know anything about Pickett's charge, it was basically a total wipeout of Pickett's entire division. Now, back to the first century, there were these, and I talk about this in my book, the disagreement between the main character and his brother over how to do this revolution against the Romans, this rebellion against the Romans, this warfare against the Romans. The one thought that all they needed to do is be pure, so they wanted purity. They wanted people to be so pure that God would stand there with his holy angels and join them in the battle. The other brother was saying, don't be foolish. We need to have allies that are with us that we can trust to do this. And there's only one way to do that. And that's, we got to get out there and test them, number one. Number two, we have to get numbers. We have to get these allies from as many places as we can. Do you see the difference that's going on there? Not that it isn't good to be righteous and pure. Of course it is. But history has shown, with maybe one exception in the Bible, Gideon, when he had all those soldiers ready to fight, and God said, "You got too many. You got to whittle it down to 300." And but if you read that very carefully, what you find is the way they drink isn't an indicator, isn't a barometer of these soldiers' purity. It's only the way that God whittled the number down to 300 out of the thousands that Gideon had. Why did he do that? Because he didn't want the Gideon and the Israelites to think that their numbers is what defeat. In other words, that their abilities were what defeated their enemies. That it was God intervening. But there's nothing to indicate there, that I can recall anyway, of this being a purity issue. Okay, it had solely to do with God showing his strength. But that was a direct revelation to Gideon, if you take the Bible narrative at face value. Now, going to the first century, I've studied this very, very hard, okay? There are several documents I've already talked about that really are important in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You don't get any of this, or very little of it anyway. You get very little of it in the New Testament, because the whole idea was to get you to subject yourself to Roman law. Now, I know that there'll be Christians out there that'll be totally against what I'm telling you here, but that's a fact, and Paul said it himself. Be submissive, be obedient to the civil authorities, particularly the Romans, and pay your tax. And I talked about that several times. So there was this push to make sure that the Romans got their due. That showed up in the Council of Yavna for the Jews, and it certainly showed up in what happened to the Messianic movement and what we call Christians now in the first century, the way they were treated. And I could get into some of the martyrs and why they were martyred, and it wasn't because they were preaching the Beatitudes, okay? It was because rebellions were going on, and they were linked to those rebellions. But that's another subject. Let me just get back to what's happening here. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I rely on quite a bit, along with Tacitus and Josephus and some of the earlier historians, which I won't bother to name. There are quite a few of them. There's no indication, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are important, as are the Epistle of James and some things that are happening in Acts. There is no indication, okay, that there was any revelation. In other words, God talking like to Gideon saying, reduce your numbers down to 300. There's no indication of that. There's a lot of talk about purity and the necessity to be pure so that you can get the help of God. And then they're trying to follow the law, in other words, the Torah, to the letter, so that they can get that. But there's no indication. As a matter of fact, the name Yeshua is in there, Yeshu, but it means God saves. It's really not talking about the individual of Jesus, okay? It's really not doing that. But despite that, the point is they're not told, even through James, the righteous teacher, and I'm saying he's the teacher of righteousness at this time, and shortly thereafter, of course, he was killed before the war actually started. They were doing guerrilla warfare prior to that, but when the actual war started in it started about 66. There's no indication, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they were getting direct revelation from God about what to do. They were saying what they needed to do to get God's attention, so that, in other words, them being pure, so that they could make the battle, okay? So that's the reason why it's very important. We can't rely merely on what God would consider our righteousness to stand up against what's happening. I'm not saying it isn't important, but any of those people who think that God's going to step in and fight this battle, you got to be really careful about how you look at that, okay? Look at what happened to them in the first century. And I could get into the parousia, it's pronounced different ways. Some people say Perusia, parousia, different. It means the return of Jesus, basically, is what it means. Generally in Greek, it means the return of the king or that kind of thing in general terms. But in the first century, it's pretty much put to the idea that Jesus will return. We could get into a lot of that, but the point is that there were these two factions. One that thought that, if they were just pure, God would be on their side, and the other was saying, no, we got to make our own preparations. You get the idea here? Okay. Who is that? Stellar. Stellar keeps doing this thing about the vaccine. I think it's a bot. Maybe if I have let's see if I can do it. I want to remove them because they do this all the time. I'm getting these bots all the time about taking the vaccine. If I have a mod on there, maybe you could get rid of Stellar 7 for me. This is just nonsense. I can't do it on my phone. It's too hard. All right, didn't mean to get off track, but that's why the bots do this kind of stuff. And also, it's propaganda. It's mind control. They think they can control my mind. Not possible, Stellar 7. Okay, so along those same lines, I've encouraged you all to get books by Robert Eisenman. Now, there are a lot of other Dead Sea Scroll scholars that you can get, can study, and I'm not telling you not to, but I'm just saying that he had the guts to show that a lot of these Dead Sea Scrolls were written right around Jesus's time and up through the destruction of the Second Temple, so they have direct applicability to the first century with what was going on with the Messianic movement, which a lot of people refer to now as Christianity. Okay, he was willing to do that. Yeah, he showed his integrity in more than one way. He put his life on the line and his welfare and his fortune to bring these books out. And I showed you the other one that I think you need to look at is James, Brother of Jesus. I have this one for me today because I want to read something out of it to you. There are nuggets in these books because he goes not just to the biblical sources, but to extra biblical sources. In other words, historical documents, the writings of other church fathers, early church fathers, not talking about Catholics necessarily, but the very, very early ones, although he gets into the church fathers too, like Epiphanius. Some people pronounce it Epiphanius. Epiphanius rather, regardless, Irenaeus, people like that. But he does use extra biblical sources because, as I've explained to you in the past, being able to bring all of these things under that historical decision matrix, for instance, that I showed you on one of my videos, you can put these things together and see how they mesh together, and then you can make really good interpretations and calculations as to when these things happen and under what circumstances and what may be real and what isn't. Now, in history, it's never an exact science, but you can get pretty close, okay? And that's what we're after. So he even uses the Talmud, okay? And that's a good thing. A lot of people, when you mention the Talmud, they automatically shut down, but you can't do that. Like any other documents that are from those early times, they were very close to the events, and so it's really good to at least get in there and take a look at a few things. Now, I could say a lot of things about the Talmud. You know, I've gone through the Mishnah and the Gemara and all that stuff, but let's just talk about one entry in the Talmud, because there are several about Jesus in the Talmud, just like there are in the Quran. As a matter of fact, as I've talked about in the past, the Quran was actually based upon parts of the Talmud, parts of Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. Okay, it was drawn from that. And Dr. Eisenman was an expert in Islamic development and all that, and he would concur with what I just told you. So, at any rate, there's a very interesting story in the Talmud that I think that you need to worry about. And this is one of the nuggets that you will find when you do this study. It's very laborious. As I've shown you, there's a lot to go through. But there's a story here I want to read you, and he's not going to actually quote the Talmud, but it'll give you an idea of what's going on. And what it is, it's an insight into the person of Jesus and his sense of humor, his real sense of humor. And Eisenman is going to show you this. He's going to tell you about it in the Talmud. And I'm not going to give you the reference in the Talmud or anything like that. I just want to read this particular entry. It's on page 141 for you people that have bought this particular book. On page 141, this is what it says. Listen to this. It's very interesting. And some of it's disturbing, but let me give you the background. So there's this question of whether or not it's proper to use the money obtained by prostitutes to give that money as an offering in the temple. Okay, that's the circumstance that's going on here. It's all about taking, blood money, the money that you give to the temple as the temple contributions, the korban they call it. Well, that's after it's in there. It's called the korban, the temple treasury. It has to be pure. It has to come from pure sources, just like the sacrifices do. So the big question was, well, can it come from the Romans who are impure? Can it come from those who aren't circumcised? That's impure. Can it come from people that have partaken in the eating of meat sacrificed to idols, or from prostitutes? Okay, the prostitutes using their money to give to the temple as part of the temple payment. So this question was given to Jesus. Okay, let me read this to you. And this is quoting Eisenman, just so you know. This is really cool. Aside, however, from attributing this proof text to the wrong prophet, what happened here is that Matthew attributed this particular thing about the 30 pieces of silver, the 300 dinar, to Jeremiah when it was really Zechariah. It's one of the mistakes in the New Testament. Okay, they quote Jeremiah. Matthew quotes Jeremiah when it's really out of Zechariah. Okay, so that's what he's talking about there. Aside, however, from attributing this proof text to the wrong prophet, a comparatively minor error, this again echoes the response Eliezer ben Hyrcanus reported hearing from Jacob of Kafar Sekania about what Jesus the Nazarene taught concerning whether it is lawful or not to give the wages earned from a prostitute's hire to the temple. Okay, so there's the background information. So the idea is they're asking Jesus whether it's proper to give a prostitute's wages as a donation to the temple. As already to some extent suggested, this is an extremely charged statement in view of the perceived behavior of the Herodian princesses, such as Herodias, Bernice, and Drusilla, and possibly even that of Helen of Adiabene herself. Jesus' response, now this is in the Talmud. Listen, this is why extra biblical sources are so important to get. And the fact that Eisenman brings this up shows his integrity, okay? And it also shows that they really knew something about this character that we know as Jesus. So here we are. Let's listen to this again. Jesus' response, that it was permissible, listen very careful, that it was permissible to use them to build an outhouse for the high priest. You get that? So they asked Jesus, well, is it okay to use the prostitute's wages to donate to the temple? And he says, well, sure, if they use it to build an outhouse, a toilet, a latrine for the high priest. Okay? You see his real sense of humor here? So let me read that again. Jesus' response that it was permissible to use them to build an outhouse for the high priest is also probably, as we said, the only real historical notice about him remaining in the whole of the Talmud, the rest having long ago fallen victim to years of censorship. Eisenman is Jewish, obviously, with a name like that, you could probably figure, and he admits that he is. Yet even with that, he says that there were subterfuges in the Talmud, not just in the New Testament and in some cases the Old. Okay? That shows Dr. Eisenman's deep integrity to finding out the truth. He's not a flimsy researcher. And he's willing to tell you about this Talmudic situation that has obviously been handed down. So the Jews knew about Jesus, and they knew about him saying that the temple can receive a prostitute's wages if they use it to build an outhouse, a latrine, or a toilet. See what you're waiting for with this? Like I say, a lot of it will be very laborious, but you'll get these little nuggets of real worth and interest if you get this study going. And you'll find a lot of that also in Josephus. You'll find things like that. Not so much Tacitus or Epiphanius. I call him Epiphanius, but it's Epiphanius. Tongue twister here. Never was much good at Greek. But those are the kinds of things that you can get into and see. So we talked about a little bit this morning. I talked about why only being just righteousness isn't really good enough, and the first century proved that. Now, it also gets into the parousia, they say it different ways, which is the return. I think I've talked about in the past, because Jesus said that those in that generation would see him return. Well, either he did or he didn't. Okay, if he didn't, then it was a false prophecy. So my feeling is that situation did occur at Masada, and that's the reason why the Romans didn't find anybody there. There was no mass suicide, which, by the way, the archaeologists really can't, there'll be some disagreement on this, but they really can't prove that there was a mass suicide at Masada. So possibly a real return did happen, and those people were saved in some way or another. That's all I got for you this morning. I got to run off. I got another meeting I got to go to, but I wanted to give you that little bit of nugget information for your for your perusal and your investigation. All right. Out here for now. Take care.